On a scorching summer day in 1885, James McKinnon only meant to pick up supplies at Clearwater Station. He hadn't smiled since losing his wife 3 years ago. But there she sat, a bride in white, left behind because her groom's family thought 42 was too old for marriage. Sarah Fleming had traveled 2,000 miles for love, only to find herself abandoned. Sometimes life's greatest blessings come disguised as heartbreak. As James approached the station, neither knew their lives were about to change forever. What made this hardened cowboy take one look at a stranger and decide to marry her that very day? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Dawn crept across the Wyoming prairie, painting the sky in strokes of amber and rose. James McKinnon had been awake for hours, his calloused fingers absently touching the silver locket that hung from a nail beside his bed. Every morning began this way, watching the sun rise, touching Mary's locket, forcing himself to face another day. The floorboards creaked beneath his boots as he made his way to the kitchen. The house felt too big now, too quiet. Even after 3 years, he still sometimes called out, "Morning, darling," before remembering there would be no answer. The coffee pot sat unwashed from yesterday, a single cup's worth of grounds dried at the bottom. Outside, the ranch was stirring. His farmhand, young Tommy Wilson, was already in the barn, the sound of milk hitting the pail, marking the rhythm of morning chores. The boy had been a godsend these past years, though James knew he couldn't keep paying him much longer if things didn't turn around. "Morning, Mr. McKinnon," Tommy called out, his voice echoing in the barn's dusty shadows. "Mail came early yesterday evening after you'd turned in. Left it on the fence post." James nodded, retrieving the envelope that bore the bank's letterhead. He didn't need to open it to know what it said. Third notice, most likely. The drought had hit everyone hard, but without Mary's clever bookkeeping and careful planning, the ranch had suffered more than most. He tucked the letter into his shirt pocket, unopened. Today's trip to town would require enough courage without adding the bank's demands to his burden. The supply list in his other pocket was short. Coffee, sugar, ammunition for the wolves that had been prowling closer lately. Basic necessities that were becoming luxuries. "Tommy," he called out, "mind those fence posts in the south pasture today. Wolf signs getting stronger." The morning passed in a blur of routine. Mending, feeding, checking the weak spots in the fence line. Every so often his hand would drift to his shirt pocket, feeling the weight of that unopened letter. Mary would have known what to do. She always did. Back in the house, James stood before the small mirror above the wash basin, attempting to tame his graying beard. His reflection stared back, weathered and worn, eyes carrying the weight of endless solitary days. The silver locket caught his eye again, and he found himself reaching for it. The clasp stuck slightly, it always did, before revealing the faded photograph within. Mary's smile, frozen in time, looked back at him. They'd taken the picture just 6 months before the fever took her. She'd been laughing at something he'd said, her eyes crinkling at the corners in that way that always made his heart skip. "What would you tell me to do, Mary?" he whispered to the empty room. "Bank's closing in, ranch is failing, and I'm tired of being alone." Only silence answered, broken by the distant lowing of cattle and Tommy's whistling from the barn. James closed the locket with a gentle click, but didn't hang it back on its nail. Instead, he slipped it into his pocket alongside the bank's letter. Maybe it was time to carry both his past and his uncertain future with him. The wagon needed work. The back wheel had been wobbling, but it would have to hold for the trip to Clearwater Station. As he hitched up the horses, James ran through his mental checklist once more. He'd need to be back before sunset. The wolves were getting bold in the twilight hours. "I'll mind things here, Mr. McKinnon," Tommy assured him, reading the worry in his employer's face. "Got my pa's old rifle if them wolves come sniffing." James managed a nod, appreciating the boy's understanding. Tommy had his own story of loss, his mother taken by the same fever that claimed Mary. Perhaps that shared grief was what made the young man such a comfort these past years. The sun was climbing higher as James set out, the wagon's wheels cutting familiar ruts in the dry earth. He'd made this trip hundreds of times before, usually with Mary beside him, her practical voice planning out their purchases, her gentle humor making the journey seem shorter. Today, he rode alone, the bank's letter burning in one pocket, Mary's locket weighing heavy in the other. Neither the morning's beauty nor Tommy's cheerful farewell could lift the shadow from his heart. Little did James McKinnon know that by sunset, everything would change. That fate had finally decided 3 years of grieving was enough, and that sometimes the answer to a prayer comes wearing a wedding dress at a train station. Sarah Fleming sat rigid in her train seat, the crumpled telegram burning a hole in her reticule. She'd read it so many times over the past 3 days that the words had become seared into her memory. Circumstances changed. Stop family concerns. Regarding age. Stop advise cancelling journey. Stop regrets stop. The countryside beyond the window blurred past, each mile taking her further from her Boston life and closer to what should have been her wedding day. She smoothed her traveling skirts, her best navy blue wool now wrinkled from days of sitting, and touched the simple cameo at her throat. At 42, she'd chosen it carefully, wanting to appear dignified rather than desperate. "More tea, miss." The porter's kind face appeared at her elbow, but Sarah shook her head. Her stomach hadn't held anything but weak tea since the telegram arrived in Chicago, intercepting her journey west. "Too old," she whispered to her reflection in the window glass, as if time were the measure of her heart's worth. The other passengers had changed several times since Boston, but she'd remained, watching stations appear and disappear, each one bringing her closer to Clearwater. She should have turned back in Chicago, or Omaha, or any of the dozen stops where she could have admitted defeat and returned to her quiet life, teaching at Miss Prendergast's school for young ladies. But something in her, perhaps pride, perhaps hope, perhaps sheer stubbornness, had kept her on this westward path. The same something that had made her answer Herbert's advertisement in the Matrimonial Times 6 months ago. Established businessman seeks educated lady companion. Age immaterial. Character essential. Their letters had been everything she'd dreamed of. Intelligent discourse about books, shared views on education, gentle hints of affection growing between the lines. Herbert had seemed so different from the Boston men who dismissed her as a shelf-worn spinster, too focused on books and teaching to catch a husband in her youth. Next stop, Clearwater Station. The conductor's voice carried through the car, startling Sarah from her reverie. She gathered her small valise. She'd sent her trunk ahead, another humiliation awaiting her, and straightened her hat with trembling fingers. The telegram seemed to mock her from its place in her reticule. Family concerns regarding age. Herbert's widowed mother and unmarried sisters had taken one look at her age in the marriage license application and decided their 48-year-old brother needed someone more suitable. Someone younger, someone with more childbearing years ahead. The train's whistle pierced the afternoon air as they approached Clearwater. Sarah caught glimpses of the town through the window, a church steeple, a general store, scattered houses pushing back against the vast Wyoming prairie. This was to have been her home, these streets she would have walked as Mrs. Herbert Crawford. Instead, she would step onto that platform a fool, a middle-aged woman who dared to dream of love only to be found wanting. The trunk with her wedding. Dress and household linens would stand as testament to her humiliation until she could arrange its return shipment east. The train shuddered to a stop, steam hissing like a chorus of whispers. Sarah remained seated as other passengers gathered their belongings and moved toward the exits. Through the window she could see families reuniting, travelers dispersing, life continuing, as if her world hadn't just shattered. Finally, when the car was nearly empty, she stood. Her legs felt wooden, unwilling to carry her into this new reality. The porter appeared again, concern evident in his dark eyes. "You need help with that bag, miss?" Sarah clutched the valise. "Closer." "No, thank you, I can manage." just as she'd always managed, alone. The platform boards creaked beneath her feet as she descended the train steps. The afternoon sun was fierce, nothing like the gentle Boston summers she knew. A bead of perspiration traced down her neck, but she refused to dab at it. Ladies didn't sweat, Miss Prendergast always said. Ladies persevered. The station master approached, his face kind but uncomfortable. "Miss Fleming, Mr. Crawford asked me to... there's a message." "I've received it, thank you." Sarah cut him off, her voice steady despite the burning in her throat. She couldn't bear another expression of pity, another reminder of her foolishness. She made her way to a bench in the station's shade, setting her valise beside her like a faithful dog. Her wedding dress waited in that trunk somewhere in the station's storage room, wrapped in tissue paper and dreams that had proven as insubstantial as morning mist. The telegram crackled as she shifted, its presence as impossible to ignore as the hollow ache in her chest. To think that such a small piece of paper could weigh so much, could carry enough words to sink a heart. James McKinnon's wagon rattled to a stop outside the Clearwater station, just as the afternoon train whistled its departure. He reached into his coat pocket, fingers brushing past Mary's locket to touch the worn leather of his Bible. The small book had been his constant companion these past 3 years, its pages dog-eared with grief and solace alike. The station platform was clearing quickly, folks hurrying to escape the August heat, all except one figure, a woman in a navy traveling dress sitting straight-backed on a bench in the shadows. Something about her stillness caught his eye. She wasn't waiting for someone. She had the look of someone who knew nobody was coming. "Afternoon, James," called Station Master Peterson, wiping his brow with a bandana. "Supply list for Thompson's store?" "Aye," James replied, but his eyes kept drifting to the woman. She held herself with dignity, despite the defeat evident in her shoulders. A familiar sort of defeat. He saw it in his own mirror often enough. "Shame about the Crawford situation," Peterson muttered, following James's gaze. "Whole town's been talking about it. Lady came all the way from Boston to marry Herbert Crawford, only to have him cry off because she's too old. His mother's doing, if you ask me. That woman could freeze hell twice over." James's hand tightened on his Bible. He knew what it was. To have love stolen away, though his thief had been fever rather than human cruelty. She's just sitting there. Train East doesn't come through until Thursday. She's got nowhere to go, poor soul. I offered to send my boy to the boarding house, but she refused, proud type. James watched as the woman, Miss Fleming he presumed, took something from her reticule. A telegram, by the look of it. Her fingers smoothed it with the same careful attention he gave to Mary's letters, now pressed between his Bible's pages. "Has she eaten?" The question surprised him as much as Peterson. "Refused anything but tea since she arrived this morning. Reminds me of you, after Mary, that same quiet way of bearing up." James nodded slowly, his free hand moving to touch the locket in his pocket. Mary had always said God worked in mysterious ways. She'd read it from this very Bible during those last fever-racked nights. "Remember Job," she'd whispered. After all his suffering, God gave him double for his troubles. He found himself walking toward the bench before he'd made any conscious decision. His boots on the wooden planks must have alerted her. She looked up, revealing eyes the color of summer sage, reddened but dry. "Ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his hat, "James McKinnon, I wonder if you might help me with something." Those sage-green eyes widened slightly at his approach, but her voice was steady. "How might I be of assistance, Mr. McKinnon?" He pulled the Bible from his pocket, its leather smooth from years of handling. "There's a passage my late wife was fond of, about new beginnings. I've been trying to find it all morning, but my reading's not what it should be." It was a lie. He knew every word in that book by heart, but something in him needed to reach out to this woman who carried herself with such wounded grace. "I'm a teacher by profession," she said, a hint of warmth touching her voice. "I'd be happy to help you search." "Sarah Fleming," she added after a moment, offering her hand. He took it gently. noting the strength in her grip despite its delicacy. As she opened the Bible, several pressed flowers fell from between its pages, Mary's bookmarks. Miss Fleming caught them before they could blow away, handling them with instinctive care. "Indian paintbrush," she said softly. "We don't have these in Boston. My wife loved them, said they were God's way of painting the prairie." James settled beside her on the bench, careful to leave proper space between them. "She pressed one for every spring we had together." Miss Fleming's fingers trembled slightly as she returned the flowers to their resting place. "How long has she been gone?" 3 years this October, fever." "I'm sorry," she said, and he could hear she meant it. Not the hollow sympathy of townsfolk who'd never known real loss, but the understanding of someone who knew how grief could hollow out a heart. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the Bible open between them. Around them, the station's usual afternoon bustle continued, but somehow their bench seemed to exist in a world apart. "My mother always said God saves his greatest surprises for those who think their story's already written," Miss Fleming said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm beginning to wonder if perhaps she was right." The station clock ticked steadily above them, its hands marking 3 o'clock. Sarah had been reading from James's Bible for nearly an hour, her clear voice bringing new life to familiar verses. Neither had mentioned the telegram lying forgotten on the bench beside them. "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord," she read. "Plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future." Her voice caught slightly on the word future. James watched her profile against the afternoon light. She'd removed her hat while reading, revealing strands of chestnut hair touched with silver at the temples. Like his Mary, she wore her years with grace, each line around her eyes telling stories of laughter and tears lived fully. The station clock chimed the quarter hour, startling them both. James suddenly remembered his supply list, the waiting wagon, the wolves that would be prowling by dusk. Yet he couldn't bear the thought of leaving her here alone. "Miss Fleming," he said, then paused, searching for the right words. "Sarah, I know we've only just met, but I believe I understand something about you, and you about me." She closed the Bible gently, her fingers lingering on its worn cover. "Perhaps we do, Mr. McKinnon." "James," he corrected softly, "I'm a plain-spoken man, so I'll say this plainly. I have a ranch 10 miles west of here. It's struggling like most everything in these parts, but it's good land, honest land." The clock ticked above them, marking each heartbeat of silence. "I've been alone these 3 years, he continued, "and I've learned there's a difference between surviving and living. When I saw you sitting here," he touched Mary's locket in his pocket, feeling somehow that his late wife was giving her blessing. "Sometimes God puts 2 broken pieces together to make something whole again." Sarah's hands tightened on the Bible. "Mr. McKinnon, James, are you saying what I think you're saying?" "I'm saying that any man fool enough to think 42 years of life makes a woman too old for love doesn't deserve the gift of your years." James turned to face her fully. "I'm saying that I may be a stranger to you, but I'm a man who knows the value of a heart that's weathered storms and kept its strength." A whisper of wind stirred the pressed flowers, peeking from the Bible's pages. The station clock marked another quarter hour. "Are you—" Sarah's voice trembled slightly. "Are you proposing marriage, Mr. McKinnon?" "I am." He smiled, the expression feeling foreign but right on his face. "I know it's sudden, some might say crazy, but I've learned that life doesn't always give you time to think things through. Sometimes you have to trust your heart's wisdom." Sarah looked down at the telegram beside her, then back at James. "I don't want charity, sir, or rescue. No more than I want a replacement for what I've lost," he replied honestly. "I'm offering partnership, understanding, a chance for both of us to begin again." The station master had stopped pretending not to listen, his usual sweeping forgotten as he stood frozen with his broom. A few townspeople lingered on the platform, drawn by the unusual scene unfolding. "Your ranch," Sarah said carefully. "You mentioned it's struggling?" It is, I won't lie to you about that. I was a teacher before. Before this journey, I'm good with figures, and I've always wanted to start a school for local children. Her eyes held a spark of something that made James's heart lift. Would that be something you'd consider? I'd consider anything that puts that light in your eyes, Miss Fleming. The station clock struck 4, its chimes ringing out across the suddenly silent platform. Sarah looked up at it, then back at James. People will say we're both crazy, she whispered. People say a lot of things. Question is, what does your heart say? She touched the cameo at her throat, then squared her shoulders. My heart says that sometimes the best stories start with an ending, and that perhaps my mother was right about God's surprises. James stood, offering her his hand. Then, Miss Sarah Fleming, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Today, if you're willing? The clock ticked once, twice, 3 times before. She placed her hand in his. Yes, Mr. James McKinnon, I believe I would. The town clerk's office was a small room in the back of Clearwater's courthouse, cramped with filing cabinets and smelling of dust and old paper. Herbert Mills, who'd served as clerk for 20 years, looked up from his ledger as James and Sarah entered, followed by an eager station master Peterson. Need a marriage license, James said simply, his hand steady on Sarah's elbow. Mills's pen clattered to his desk. A marriage. Today. But Miss Fleming, I thought. He caught himself, glancing at the half-written license for her cancelled wedding still on his desk. You'll need to draw up a new one, Sarah said quietly, her chin lifted with quiet dignity. Different groom. The clerk fumbled with his papers, clearly flustered. But the waiting period, the usual procedures. Herb, James interrupted, you've known me 15 years, known my family longer. I'm asking you to help us do this right, and do it today. Mills looked between them, his rheumy eyes taking in James's quiet determination and Sarah's composed face. Does this have anything to do with Crawford's mother? Because if she's pressured you, Miss Fleming, no one has pressured me, Mr. Mills. Sarah's voice was firm. This is my choice, my second chance. James felt her fingers tighten on his arm at these words, and he covered her hand with his own. The simple gesture seemed to convince Mills more than any words could have. Well then, the clerk said, pulling out a fresh form. Let's see what we can do. The scratching of his pen filled the small office as he carefully wrote out their details. Sarah's hand trembled slightly as she spelled out her parents' names, her Boston address. James noticed how she hesitated before the word spinster, her fingers white-knuckled on the edge of Mills's desk. You're sure about this? James whispered, low enough that only she could hear. It's not too late to... I'm sure, she interrupted, turning to meet his eyes. Strangely more sure than I was about the other arrangement. The clerk looked up from his writing. Need 2 witnesses. Peterson here can be one, but we'll need... I'll fetch Reverend Thomas, Peterson offered eagerly. He's usually at the church this time of day, preparing his Sunday sermon. As Peterson hurried out, Mills continued his methodical documentation. Place of residence after marriage? McKinnon Ranch, James answered, then glanced at Sarah. Unless... McKinnon Ranch, she confirmed, and something in her tone made his heart lighter than it had been in years. The office door burst open, admitting Peterson with a slightly dishevelled Reverend Thomas, whose collar was askew, as if he'd been interrupted mid-dress. James McKinnon, the Reverend said, catching his breath. When Peterson here told me, well, I hardly believed it. But seeing you both, he paused, studying them with kind eyes. Sometimes the Lord works in mysterious ways. Sarah's hand found the Bible in her reticule, James's Bible now their shared possession. Yes, she said softly, he does. Mills finished the license with a flourish, then looked up expectantly. Shall I file this now, or would you prefer to wait until after the ceremony? James looked at Sarah, letting her set the pace. She squared her shoulders, every inch the dignified teacher despite her travel-worn dress and the afternoon's emotional tumult. File it now, she said firmly. We've both waited long enough for happiness. The clerk nodded, reaching for his official seal. The heavy brass stamp came down with a solid thunk that seemed to echo in the small room. James watched as the ink dried, making their intentions official in the eyes of the law. Marriage license for James Andrew McKinnon and Sarah Elizabeth Fleming, Mills read aloud. Dated August 15th, 1885. He looked up at them. Once I file this, there's no turning back. Sarah reached for the pen, her handwriting elegant and sure as she signed her name. James followed, his rougher script beside hers, looking like their lives themselves, different paths joining into one. Witnessed by George Peterson, station master, and Reverend William Thomas, Mills continued, as the other men added their signatures. May God bless this union. The late afternoon sun slanted through the office's small window, catching the wet ink as Mills carefully blotted the signatures. In that golden light, Sarah turned to James, her eyes bright with unshed tears and something that looked remarkably like hope. Well, Mr. McKinnon, she said softly, it seems we're halfway married. Indeed we are, Miss Fleming, he replied, offering her his arm. Shall we make it official? Word spread quickly in Clearwater. By the time James and Sarah reached the small white church, a crowd had gathered on its wooden steps. Women whispered behind their hands, men stood with hats respectfully removed, and a group of children darted between the tombstones in the adjacent cemetery, clutching fistfuls of wild prairie flowers. Little Mary Beth Peterson, the station master's daughter, approached Sarah shyly. Ma'am, we picked these for you. She thrust forward a bouquet of Indian paintbrush, black-eyed Susans, and prairie sage, tied with a faded blue ribbon, likely borrowed from someone's hair. Sarah knelt, heedless of her skirts in the dust, and took the bouquet as if it were the finest roses from a Boston conservatory. They're beautiful, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Just perfect. The church's interior was cool and dim, smelling of beeswax and old hymnals. Afternoon light filtered through simple stained glass, casting patches of color across the worn wooden pews. James noticed Sarah glancing at the empty front rows where a bride's family would typically sit. We can wait, he offered quietly. Send word to your people in Boston. She shook her head, clutching her wild bouquet. My family is here now. Being made right here, today. Reverend Thomas cleared his throat from the pulpit. Shall we begin? The scattered townspeople who'd followed them in settled into the pews. Mrs. Thompson, the general store owner's wife, had somehow produced a piano accompaniment, though no one had requested it. The familiar strains of the wedding march seemed almost comical in their formality, given the circumstances. Dearly beloved, Reverend Thomas began, his voice carrying to the rafters. We are gathered here today to witness something remarkable. Not just the joining of two lives, but the triumph of hope over hardship, of faith over fear. James stood straight-backed beside Sarah, aware of Mary's locket in his pocket and this brave woman's presence at his side. The wild flowers in her hands perfumed the air with the scent of prairie summer. Marriage, the Reverend continued, is not to be entered into lightly. Some might say these two have done just that, choosing to join their lives after mere hours of acquaintance. But I say to you, there are moments when God's hand moves so clearly that questioning his timing becomes an act of doubt rather than wisdom. Sarah's fingers trembled slightly around the bouquet's stems. James reached over and steadied them with his own weathered hand. James McKinnon, Reverend Thomas said, do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife? To love her, honor her, and cherish her in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, until death do you part? I do. James's voice was quiet but firm, carrying the weight of certainty. And Sarah Fleming, do you take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband? To love him, honor him, and cherish him in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, until death do you part? Sarah lifted her chin, her voice clear and strong. I do. The rings, Reverend Thomas started, then caught himself realizing this hasty ceremony wouldn't have such preparations. Wait, called a voice from the back. Mrs. Thompson hurried forward, pulling something from her finger. "My mother's ring. She'd want it used for love." She pressed a simple gold band into Sarah's hand. Before James could speak, Station Master Peterson stepped up, removing his own wedding ring. "Martha's been gone 5 years, he said gruffly. "She'd box my ears if I didn't offer it." The borrowed rings were warm from their previous owner's hands as James and Sarah exchanged them, each one carrying its own history of love and loss into this new beginning. "By the power vested in me," Reverend Thomas pronounced, his voice thick with emotion, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." A shaft of late afternoon sun broke through the clouds, sending rainbow light through the stained glass to dance across Sarah's face as James leaned in to kiss his bride. Her lips tasted of tea and tears and promise. The small congregation burst into applause, and Mrs. Thompson struck up a joyful hymn on the piano. The children who'd gathered the wildflowers scattered petals from their remaining blooms, and the bouquet in Sarah's hands seemed to glow with all the colors of the prairie summer. As they turned to face their impromptu wedding guests, James heard Sarah whisper, so quietly he might have imagined it, "Thank you, Lord, for unanswered prayers that lead us to answered ones." The wagon wheel hit a rut in the road, sending a jolt through the wooden seat. Sarah instinctively grabbed the side panel, her wildflower bouquet still clutched in her other hand. James steadied her with a gentle touch to her elbow. "Sorry about that," he said. "Road gets rough after the creek crossing. Been meaning to fill these holes," but he trailed off, suddenly aware of how many things he needed to explain, to apologize for. "No need for sorry," Sarah replied, adjusting her skirts. "I may be from Boston, but I'm not made of china." Her smile took any sting from the words. The late afternoon sun painted the prairie gold, casting long shadows across the rutted road. They'd left Clearwater behind, Sarah's trunk loaded in the cume, wagon's bed alongside James's neglected supply list. The steady creaking of the wheel marked time like a metronome, accompanying the horse's hoofbeats. "Tell me about the ranch," Sarah said, breaking a comfortable silence. "I should know what I'm riding into, shouldn't I?" James appreciated her directness. 200 acres, most of it grassland. Good for cattle when the rains come. House needs work. Was building it room by room with Mary before. He cleared his throat. "Got about 30 head of cattle, 2 working horses besides these, and a few chickens. Tommy Wilson, my hand, lives in the old cabin near the creek." The wheel hit another rut, its protest louder this time. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "And the finances. Banks getting impatient. Droughts hit everyone hard, but..." He hesitated, then decided she deserved the full truth. "Without Mary's bookkeeping, I've let things slide. Could lose it all by winter if something doesn't change." To his surprise, Sarah's face brightened. "Bookkeeping? I kept the accounts. At Miss Prendergast's for 15 years. Numbers are like old friends to me." The wagon wheel creaked as they rounded a bend, revealing the first glimpse of McKinnon Ranch in the distance. James watched Sarah's face carefully, seeing her take in the weathered fence posts, the half-finished north wing of the house, the cattle gathering at the evening watering hole. "It's not much," he began, but she cut him off. "It's everything," she said firmly. "It's a beginning." The wheel hit another rut, harder this time. The familiar wobble in the back axle seemed worse than that morning. James pulled the horses to a stop, concern creasing his brow. "Need to check that wheel. Been acting up lately." He climbed down, offering Sarah his hand. "Might as well stretch. Your legs while I take a look." She accepted his help, then gathered her skirts to follow him to the wagon's rear. The wheel in question was indeed worse for wear, its wooden spokes showing signs of stress where they met the hub. "I can manage it home," James said, more to himself than Sarah, "but it'll need replacing soon. Another expense we can't really afford." Sarah knelt beside him, heedless of her dress, and ran a finger along one of the cracks. "Like veins in an old hand, aren't they? Each one telling a story of journeys taken." James looked at her in surprise. That's exactly what Mary used to say. She had a way of finding beauty in broken things. Perhaps that's what drew us both to our respective spouses, Sarah said softly, then blushed at her own boldness. The wheel gave another creak, as if agreeing. James found himself laughing for the first time in what felt like years. Miss Fleming, Mrs. McKinnon, he corrected himself. I believe you might be right. She stood, brushing dust from her skirts. Sarah, she reminded him, we're married now after all. Sarah, he repeated, the name feeling right on his tongue. The wagon wheel groaned again as they climbed back aboard, but somehow its complaints seemed less worrisome with her beside him. They continued on, the wheel marking each rotation with its steady voice. Sarah's bouquet had begun to wilt in the late afternoon heat, but she held it proudly, like a badge of honor. The prairie stretched out before them, painted in shades of gold and purple by the approaching sunset. Will Tommy be surprised, Sarah asked suddenly, to find his employer married? James chuckled. Probably less surprised than I am. Boys. Been telling me for months I need someone to help set things right. He glanced at her, though I doubt even he imagined it happening quite like this. The wheel's rhythm provided a backbeat to their quiet laughter, its creaking a strange music that seemed to say, here is a story beginning, here is a journey starting, here are two lives turning together like wooden spokes around a common center, growing stronger for the sharing of the load. The kitchen was the heart of any home, Sarah had always believed. Standing in the McKinnon Ranch kitchen as dusk gathered outside, she took in every detail. The wood-burning stove with its temperamental damper, shelves lined with dusty mason, jars and hanging prominently near the stove, a cast-iron skillet that had clearly seen better days. Mary's pride, James said softly, following her gaze to the skillet. Brought it all the way from Pennsylvania when we married. Said no proper kitchen was complete without one. Sarah approached the skillet, running a finger along its surface. It needs seasoning, she observed, but it's a fine piece. Haven't used it since. James cleared his throat. Been taking meals with Tommy mostly, or making do. The kitchen windows reflected their uncertain movements as they navigated this new space together. Sarah had removed her hat and gloves, but still wore her traveling dress, now creased and dusty from the wagon ride. James stood awkwardly by the door, as if unsure of his place in what had suddenly become a shared domain. Mr. McKinnon, James, Sarah corrected herself, would you object if I tried to make us some supper? The relief on his face was evident. Object? I'd be grateful. Though I should warn you, supplies are basic. Sarah was already rolling up her sleeves, examining the pantry with a teacher's careful scrutiny. Flour, salt, a bit of lard, eggs from your chickens? At his nod, she continued, and is that a ham hanging in the back? Tommy's mother sends one over sometimes. Says she can't bear to think of me starving. Smart woman, Sarah murmured. Reaching for the skillet, would you mind building up the stove fire? And perhaps you could show me where you keep the well bucket. The simple requests seemed to ease James's tension, giving him purpose. As he moved to the stove, Sarah took the heavy skillet to the wash basin, beginning the process of restoring its surface. The rhythmic scrubbing filled the growing darkness with a homey sound. Found some potatoes in the root cellar, Tommy's voice called from the back door, making them both start. The young man stopped short at the sight of Sarah in the kitchen, his eyes widening. Mr. McKinnon, is this Tommy Wilson? James said formally. Meet Mrs. Sarah McKinnon. The boy's mouth fell open, then split into a wide grin. Well, I'll be. When you rode into town this morning, I never thought... He caught himself, touching his cap respectfully. Welcome, Ma'am. We're right pleased to have you. Sarah smiled, warming to his earnest greeting. Thank you, Tommy. Would you join us for supper? I'm attempting to revive this lovely skillet with some ham and potatoes. Oh, no, ma'am. I couldn't impose on your first... Nonsense, she interrupted firmly. From what I understand, you've been keeping this man fed for 3 years. The least I can do is return the favor. The kitchen gradually filled with warmth as the stove fire built and Sarah worked her magic with the skillet. James and Tommy brought in fresh water, blackened the stove, and set the rough wooden table with the ranch's mismatched plates. The ham sizzled in the newly seasoned skillet, its aroma mixing with the smell of frying potatoes and the cornbread Sarah had somehow conjured from the meager pantry supplies. The familiar sounds and scents seemed to ease the strangeness between them all. Mary loved cooking too, Tommy ventured during a quiet moment. Used to say a meal shared was a blessing doubled. James stiffened slightly, but Sarah's hand found his arm. She sounds like a wise woman. I hope... She paused, choosing her words carefully. I hope you'll tell me more about her when you're ready. She's part of this home story, after all. The skillet popped and sizzled, drawing their attention back to the present moment. Sarah deftly turned the potatoes, their edges crisping to golden brown. First meal in a new home, she said softly, more to herself than the others. My mother would say it sets the tone for all that follows. James moved to stand beside her at the stove, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. And what tone would you say this one's setting? Sarah looked at the restored skillet, at Tommy setting the table with careful precision, at the warm light spilling from the kitchen windows into the gathering night. Hope, she said finally, and perhaps a bit of magic. Dawn painted the eastern sky in whispers of pink when Sarah discovered the morning glories. They climbed the weathered porch posts, their violet-blue flowers just beginning to open in the early light. She stood in her nightgown and shawl, watching as each bloom unfurled like a tiny miracle. Mary planted those, James's voice came softly from behind her, said every home needed something that opened to greet the sun. Sarah turned to find him already dressed for ranch work, but lingering in the doorway. They're beautiful, she said, like little pieces of sky caught in vine. Never thought of them that way. He stepped onto the porch, careful to maintain a proper distance. Their wedding night had been spent in separate rooms, him in the barn loft, giving her privacy to settle into the house. Now morning brought a new awareness of their peculiar situation. I've made coffee, Sarah offered, and there are eggs from yesterday. Unless you usually breakfast with Tommy. No, James ran a hand through his hair. Truth is, I usually just grab whatever's handy. Haven't had a proper morning meal since. Well then, she said briskly, that's changing today. She moved toward the door, then stopped, facing him. James, thank you for giving me space last night. It was gentlemanly of you. His weather-worn face softened. Seemed right. This whole thing between us, it needs time to find its feet. The morning glories bobbed in a gentle breeze as they made their way inside. The kitchen still held the warmth of yesterday's revival, the cast-iron skillet hanging ready for a new day's use. Sarah moved with quiet efficiency, stoking the stove and setting coffee to boil. She'd changed into one of her simpler dresses, practical for housework, but still bearing the Eastern refinement of her previous life. Might want to warn you, James said, settling at the table. Tommy's likely to bring his mother around today. News like this, it'll bring folks calling. Good. Sarah cracked eggs into the skillet with practiced ease. I'd like to meet our neighbors, and Mrs. Wilson especially, since she's been looking after you both. Looking after? James's tone held amused protest. We managed well enough. Sarah raised an eyebrow at the dusty shelves, the stack of unwashed clothes visible through the bedroom door. Of course you did. Their shared chuckle seemed to ease something between them. Outside, the morning glories continued their daily dance with the sun, each flower reaching toward the light. I was thinking, Sarah said, sliding eggs onto their plates, about the north wing you mentioned, the unfinished rooms. James nodded, accepting a cup of coffee. Had plans for them once. Study for Mary, maybe a nursery. He trailed off, then rallied. But that was another life. What would you think about turning one into a schoolroom? She sat across from him, her own coffee untouched. You said there are children scattered on nearby ranches. They must need teaching. You're serious about that, starting a school? I am. Her eyes held that same spark he'd noticed yesterday at the courthouse. It could bring in some income, help with the bank, and every child deserves an education even out here. James studied her over his coffee cup. The morning light through the window caught the silver threads in her hair, making them shine like the dew on the morning glories outside. You've got it all figured out already, haven't you? Hardly, she smiled. But I've learned that sometimes the best plans grow like those vines out there, reaching for light, one bloom at a time. They finished breakfast in comfortable silence, the rhythms of ranch morning drifting in through open windows. Cattle lowed in distant pastures, chickens clucked in the yard, and Tommy's whistling could be heard from the barn. "Well," James said finally, standing to face the day's work, "I'd say this beats grabbing whatever's handy." Sarah began gathering dishes, her movements sure and purposeful. "Tomorrow I'll make biscuits, and perhaps we can clear one of those north rooms." He paused at the door, watching her. She'd taken down her hair to sleep and hadn't yet fully pinned it up. The loose strands caught the morning light like the silken threads of the morning glory vines. "Sarah?" She turned, hands deep in dishwater. "Yes? I'm glad you didn't turn back at Chicago, or Omaha, or any of those other stations." Her smile bloomed slow and sure, like the flowers greeting the sun. "So am I, James McKinnon. So am I." 3 days after their impromptu wedding, the McKinnons' wagon rolled into Clearwater for supplies. Sarah sat straight-backed beside James, wearing her second-best dress and a quiet determination. The general store's ledger would record their first purchases as a married couple, a moment both mundane and momentous. "Ready?" James asked as he helped her down from the wagon. "As I'll ever be," Sarah replied, brushing dust from her skirts. Already she could see curtains twitching in shop windows, curious faces turning their way. The bell above Thompson's General store announced their entrance. Mrs. Thompson looked up from her position behind the counter, where she was recording entries in the store's massive ledger. "Well," she said warmly, "if it isn't our newest bride, and wearing Martha Peterson's ring proud as you please." Sarah touched the borrowed wedding band, which she'd polished to a soft shine. "I hope to do it justice, Mrs. Thompson." "Emma, please." "And you already have, dear. Herbert Crawford's mother has been in here 3 times, sour as spoiled milk, watching that train schedule. Serves her right, if you ask me." James cleared his throat. "We've come for supplies, Emma. Sarah's looking to set up proper housekeeping." Mrs. Thompson brightened, pulling the ledger forward. "Then let's start a new page for the McKinnon household. What do you need, dear?" Sarah produced a carefully written list. "Fabric for curtains, if you have any. Sugar, coffee, lamp oil, thread. For mending." She hesitated, then added, "And perhaps some primer books, if you stock them." "Primers?" Emma's eyebrows rose. "Planning to start that school already, are you?" "Word travels fast," James commented dryly. "Faster than summer lightning in this town." Emma began noting items in her ledger. "And a good thing, too. The Wilsons' youngest could use some schooling. Smart as a whip, that one, but wild as prairie grass." As Emma gathered their supplies, other customers drifted in. Sarah felt their eyes on her, heard their whispered conversations. She focused on examining fabric bolts, discussing prices and qualities with Emma as if she'd been doing it all her life. "Your credit's good here, James," Emma said when the total was tallied in the ledger. "Always has been." Sarah touched James's arm before he could protest. "We'll pay what we can now," she said firmly, "and work out a schedule for the rest if you're willing." Emma's respect visibly grew. "Just like Mary," she said softly. "She always kept the cleanest books in town." She turned the ledger toward Sarah. "See here? Her last entry 3 years ago. Neat as printing." Sarah studied the careful columns, the precise figures. She was good with numbers. The best. Helped half the ranchers around here keep their accounts straight. Emma's eyes turned thoughtful. "You know, if you're planning to teach, there might be call for adult lessons too. Bookkeeping, figures, that sort of thing." The bell chimed again, admitting Mrs. Crawford and her eldest daughter. The store fell silent. Sarah felt James tense beside her, but she kept her voice steady. "That's an excellent suggestion, Emma. Perhaps we could discuss it over tea sometime." Mrs. Crawford made A small sound of disapproval, but Sarah didn't turn. Instead, she watched Emma enter their purchases in the ledger, each item a brick in the foundation of their new life. Fabric for curtains to soften morning light, primers for young minds, sugar for biscuits that would make a house smell like home. Your change, Emma said, counting out coins, then loud enough to carry, "And welcome to Clearwater, Mrs. McKinnon. We're blessed to have you." They loaded their purchases into the wagon under the watchful eyes of the town. Sarah could hear the whispers, feel the stares, but she kept her head high. Let them talk. Let them see how a woman of 42 carried herself with dignity. As James helped her up to the wagon seat, she caught sight of their reflection in the store window. A tall, weathered rancher and his city-bred wife, their differences as clear as day. But the ledger had recorded their first purchases together, marking the beginning of something new, a marriage of practical needs and hopeful hearts. "Ready to head home?" James asked quietly. Home. Such a simple word for such a complex thing. Sarah adjusted her bonnet against the afternoon sun. "Yes," she said, "I believe I am." Behind them, Emma Thompson added one final note to her ledger. "McKinnon's first shop as man and wife, a good match if I ever saw one." The old brass school bell arrived on a Tuesday, nearly 3 weeks after the wedding. Tommy found it in his mother's attic, a relic from Clearwater's first schoolhouse, long since replaced by the newer brick building in town. "It's got a lovely tone," Sarah said, running her fingers over the bell's tarnished surface. She stood in what had been the ranch house's north wing, now transformed by determination and elbow grease. New curtains brightened the windows, and simple benches, crafted by James and Tommy during evening hours, lined the walls. "Ma says it called 3 generations of kids to learning," Tommy offered. "Reckon it's got some magic left in it." James watched from the doorway as Sarah hung the bell near the window. In the weeks since their hasty marriage, he'd watched his failing ranch begin to pulse with new life. The house, long a monument to grief, now smelled of fresh bread and furniture polish. Sarah's precise figures filled the account books, making sense of years of scattered records. "First class starts Monday," Sarah said, stepping back to admire the bell's placement. The Wilsons 3, the Hendersons twins, and little Mary Beth Peterson. 6 students to start. 7, Tommy corrected, shuffling his feet. "If you don't mind teaching someone a bit older, been wanting to learn my figures proper." Sarah's face lit up. "Tommy, I'd be honored." She turned to James. "And you'll join us for the evening sessions?" Emma Thompson's arranged for 3 other ranchers' wives to come learn bookkeeping. James nodded, still amazed at how quickly she'd woven herself into the community's fabric. The previous Sunday, she'd hosted a sewing circle on the porch, the women's chatter mixing with the sound of clicking needles as they helped her piece together curtains and cushions. The ranch itself seemed to respond to her presence. The vegetable garden, long gone to weeds, now sprouted neat rows of late summer plantings. The chicken coop had been repaired, the hens responding with increased egg production. Even the troublesome north fence stood straight again, thanks to Sarah's discovery of an error in the supply ledger that had freed up funds for new posts. "James," Sarah's voice pulled him from his thoughts. "Would you test the bell? See if it still has its voice?" He stepped forward, taking the bell's rope in his hand. The clear, bright tone that rang out across the prairie brought an unexpected lump to his throat. How long had it been since these walls had heard anything but silence? "Perfect," Sarah breathed. Then, noticing his expression, "Are you all right?" "Just thinking," he said slowly, "about what Mary used to say, about how a home needs 3 things, love to warm it, work to maintain it, and dreams to help it grow." Sarah's hand found his, their borrowed wedding rings touching. "Wise words." "She'd have liked you," James said suddenly, "or would have appreciated how you've brought all 3 back here." Tommy diplomatically found something fascinating to study out the window as Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "I hope," she said softly, "that somewhere she knows her home is being loved again. The bell's rope swayed gently in the breeze from the open window, its shadow dancing across the freshly swept floor. Outside, the afternoon sun gilded the prairie grass, and distant cattle grazed peacefully. The sound of horses in the barn reminded them that ranch work waited, even on this momentous day. "Best get back to it," Tommy said, touching his hat brim. "Those fence posts won't set themselves." As he left, Sarah moved to the newly installed blackboard, carefully writing out the next week's lessons in her elegant hand. James watched her for a moment, marveling at how naturally she fit into this space that had once been meant for another purpose, another life. "Sarah?" She turned, chalk dust on her fingers. "Yes? Thank you. For seeing possibility where I could only see loss." She smiled, that warm, sure smile that had first caught his attention at the train station. "That's what teachers do, Mr. McKinnon. We look at empty rooms and see futures waiting to be written." The school bell caught the late afternoon light, its brass surface reflecting like a promise. Come Monday, it would ring out across the prairie, calling children to learn, women to master their accounts, and one grateful rancher to count his unexpected blessings. But for now, it hung silent witness to two people learning that love, like education, knows no age limit, only the limitless possibility of beginning again. The storm came without warning, turning the October afternoon black as pitch. Sarah was teaching when the first gust hit, rattling the schoolroom windows with such force that little Mary Beth Peterson burst into tears. "Class dismissed," Sarah announced, keeping her voice steady as thunder cracked overhead. "Tommy, help the children home before—" The rest of her words were lost in a violent crash from the north pasture. James burst through the door, rain dripping from his hat. Fences down, lightning must have hit it, cattle are spooked. Sarah was already moving, trading her teaching shawl for an oilskin coat. "How many headed for the break? You're not coming out in this?" "How many?" Her voice brooked no argument. "At least 30 head. Tommy and I can't manage alone." Another crash of thunder punctuated his words. Then it settled. Sarah gathered her skirts, pinning them up for riding. "Mary Beth, take the others to the storm cellar. There's bread and water there. Don't come out until one of us returns." The wind nearly knocked them off their feet as they stepped outside. Rain fell in stinging sheets, and lightning turned the sky into day for brilliant, terrifying moments. Sarah could see the broken fence post through the deluge, split and smoking, where lightning had struck. Beyond it, panicked cattle were already streaming through the gap. "Take the south side!" James shouted over the storm's roar. "Tommy and—" "I will try to turn them at the creek." Sarah swung onto the mare James had been training her to ride, her heart pounding but her hands steady on the reins. 3 weeks of riding lessons hadn't prepared her for this, but necessity was forcing confidence. The cattle were dark shapes in the rain, their eyes rolling white with fear. Sarah urged her horse forward, using her voice as she'd seen James. "Here, turn back now, you foolish things." Lightning revealed Tommy ahead, his horse struggling against the wind as he tried to head off the lead steer. The broken fence post stood like an accusing finger against the sky, marking where their barrier against chaos had failed. A younger cow broke from the herd, heading straight for a steep ravine. Without thinking, Sarah kicked her mare into a gallop, rain stinging her face as she raced to intercept. She could hear James shouting something, but the wind tore his words away. The mare seemed to understand their purpose, responding to Sarah's slightest guidance. They cut in front of the panicked cow, turning it back toward the herd with a precision that would have been impossible a month ago. "Well done!" Tommy's voice carried faintly through the storm. He'd managed to turn the lead steer, and the rest of the cattle were beginning to circle, their panic easing as the familiar presence of riders surrounded them. James appeared through the rain, his face a mix of worry and pride. "Sarah, you—" Lightning struck again, closer this time. Sarah's mare reared, but years of teaching fidgety children had given her a steady seat. She brought the horse under control, then pointed toward where more cattle were approaching the gap. For what felt like hours, they worked in the storm's fury. The broken fence post became their rally point as they slowly gathered the scattered herd. Sarah's arms ached. Her dress was soaked through beneath the oilskin, but a fierce joy filled her at working alongside her husband as an equal partner. Finally, the last steer was turned back. James had rolled spare posts from the barn, making temporary repairs to the fence line. The storm was moving east, its fury spending itself over the open prairie. "Never seen anything like it," Tommy said, helping Sarah down from her mare. "Where you turn that heifer, Mrs. McKinnon, like you've been riding all your life." "Books aren't the only things that can teach us," Sarah replied, legs trembling now that the crisis had passed. "Sometimes life demands we learn new skills quickly." James was examining the broken fence post, his face troubled. "Could have lost half the herd if you hadn't been here, but I was." Sarah moved to stand beside him, both of them leaning against each other's strength. "And now we know we can face a crisis together." The post's splintered wood seemed to map their own lives, broken patterns that, when pieced together differently, could become something stronger than before. "You're shivering," James noticed, shrugging out of his coat to wrap around her shoulders. "Yes, well," Sarah managed to smile. "I don't recall this being covered in my teaching credentials." His laugh was rough with relief and something deeper. "Sarah McKinnon, you're a wonder. Don't think I've ever seen a city woman take to ranch life like you have." "Perhaps," she said softly. "I was just waiting for the right ranch." The letter arrived 6 weeks after the wedding, its Boston postmark and elegant handwriting instantly recognizable to Sarah. She held her sister Rebecca's letter in trembling hands, standing in the kitchen where morning sun streamed through her newly hung curtains. "Something wrong?" James asked, pausing in the doorway with an armload of firewood. "Not wrong, exactly." Sarah traced her sister's familiar script. "Just unexpected. I wrote to my family after our marriage, but I didn't truly expect." James set the wood down carefully. "Would you like privacy to read it?" "No," she said quickly. "No, I'd like you here." The paper crackled as she opened it, Rebecca's words spilling out like a flood. "Dearest Sarah, your letter arrived yesterday, and I confess I dropped Mother's best teacup in shock. Married to a rancher. Our practical, steady Sarah who always said romance was for younger women. I hardly know whether to scold you for such impetuousness or applaud your courage." Sarah's voice faltered. James moved closer, his presence steady and warm at her shoulder. "Go on," he encouraged softly. "Mother, of course, is scandalized, but then when isn't she? Father said nothing at first, just sat in his study for a long while. Then he emerged and announced that any man who could recognize your worth at a glance must be worth knowing." Tears pricked at Sarah's eyes. James's hand found hers, their borrowed wedding rings touching. "I've enclosed something," Rebecca's letter continued. "Found it in that trunk of grandmother's things. It's not much, but perhaps it will help make your new house feel more like home." A small daguerreotype slipped from the envelope. There, grandmother on her own wedding day, proud in her 43rd year, standing beside the grandfather who'd loved her until his dying day. "She married late too," Sarah whispered. "I'd almost forgotten. Mother never approved, but they were so happy together." James studied the image. "You have her smile, that same look of knowing your own mind." Sarah leaned into his shoulder, letting his strength support her as she read on. Rebecca's words painted their Boston life in vivid detail. Mother's garden club dramas, father's latest academic pursuits, the family cat's ongoing war with the baker's dog. "They're still there," Sarah said wonderingly. "All my old life just continuing on. Yet it feels like a story about someone else now." "Do you regret it?" James asked quietly. "Trading brick walls for prairie winds." Sarah looked around their kitchen, at the herbs drying from the rafters, the students' drawings tacked by the window, the comfortable clutter of a life being built together. "No," she said firmly, "but I'm glad to know I haven't lost them entirely. Rebecca says she might visit in the spring if we're willing." "Of course we are." James's voice was warm, though we should warn her about Tommy's singing. "Wouldn't want to frighten her back east." Sarah laughed, then grew thoughtful. James, would you tell me more about your family, about Marries? It feels right, somehow, today. He was quiet for a long moment, then reached for Mary's locket, which now sat in a place of honor on the mantel. Mary had a sister too. Caroline lives in Pennsylvania with 4 boys and a husband who builds furniture. They spent the morning sharing stories, weaving their separate histories into a shared tapestry. Sarah learned about James's younger brother who died in childhood, about Mary's father who taught her to love horses, about the aunt who gave them the cast-iron skillet as a wedding gift. In return, she told him about Rebecca's childhood adventures, about her father's passionate debates with his university colleagues, about the grandmother who married for love at 43 and never regretted a day. Family isn't just blood, James said finally, holding up the daguerreotype. It's choice too, the people we gather around us, the stories we choose to keep alive. Sarah thought of her students, of Tommy and his mother, of Emma Thompson and the sewing circle ladies. Yes, she agreed. It's a tapestry we weave from all the threads life gives us. The morning sun caught the daguerreotype's silver surface, reflecting like a mirror of possibility. In it, Sarah could see her grandmother's joy, her own present contentment, and the future stretching out before them, a future rich with both old memories and new stories waiting to be lived. The harvest moon hung low and golden over the prairie, casting long shadows across the McKinnon ranch. Sarah sat in her rocking chair by the fire, carefully stitching the final piece of their first quilt together. The pattern was her own design. Morning, glories and prairie grass woven together in a dance of east meets west. That's fine work, James said softly, pausing in his evening accounts to watch her hands move. The ledgers showed promise now. Sarah's bookkeeping classes had brought in enough extra income to ease their burden with the bank. It's our story, she replied, holding up the nearly finished quilt. See here, these blue pieces are from my Boston teaching dress, and these browns are from your old work shirt, the one that caught on the fence last month. James moved closer, calloused fingers, tracing the intricate pattern. And this bright yellow, Mary Beth Peterson's hair ribbon. She insisted I use it, said it would bring sunshine to our dreams. Sarah smiled at the memory. The children have become quite proprietary about our home. Indeed, the ranch had transformed with the harvest season. The schoolroom now boasted 12 regular students, their lessons punctuated by the clear ring of the brass bell. The evening adult classes had grown too, with ranchers' wives trading recipes and life wisdom alongside their bookkeeping lessons. Tommy's mother sent word, James said, settling back at his desk. They've had a good yield this year, wants to share some preserves, says it's payment for teaching Tommy his figures. Sarah tied off her thread, remembering Tommy's proud face when he'd first calculated his own wages correctly. He's a quick study. Might make a fine teacher himself someday. The quilt spread across her lap like a map of their merged lives. Here was a square from Mrs. Thompson's sewing basket. There a piece of the curtains Mary had hung years ago. Even the backing had its story. Fabric meant for Sarah's wedding dress to Herbert Crawford, now repurposed for a truer love, the harvest. Festival's next week, James mentioned, his pencil scratching against the ledger. Town's expecting us to attend. Sarah nodded, adding another careful stitch. Mrs. Henderson asked if I'd help judge the preserves competition, and Tommy's mother wants our quilt in the crafts display. Our quilt? James looked up, surprised. You did all the work. But it's our story, Sarah replied simply. Every piece chosen together, every memory shared. She held up the nearly finished creation, moonlight and firelight playing across its surface. See how the pattern flows? Like morning glories climbing a fence post? James set aside his ledger and came to kneel beside her chair. In the flickering light, she could see the softness in his eyes that appeared more and more these days. When you arrived at that station, he said quietly, I thought I was offering you shelter. Never dreamed you'd bring so much life back to this place. Sarah's fingers found a patch of faded calico, Mary's old apron, saved by James all these years. "We've built something new from pieces of what was," she said, "like this quilt, not erasing the past, but weaving it into our future." Outside, the harvest moon painted the prairie silver. The newly repaired fence posts stood straight and strong, barely showing where the lightning had struck. In the barn, they could hear Tommy finishing the evening chores, his cheerful whistling carrying on the autumn breeze. "Almost done," Sarah murmured, working on the final corner. The quilt would be ready for the festival, a testimony to how life could piece together beauty from fragments of joy and sorrow, hope and memory. James watched her work, his ledger forgotten. "You know what Mary used to say about quilts?" Sarah's hands stilled. "Tell me." "Said they were like marriages, stronger, for being made of different pieces, all joined together with patience and care." Sarah tied off her last stitch, then held out her hand to her husband. Together, they shook out the quilt, letting it catch the mixed light of moon and fire. Their borrowed wedding rings glinted as they worked, no longer feeling borrowed at all. "There," Sarah said softly. "Finished, just in time for the cold nights ahead." James gathered her close, the quilt wrapped around them both. "Not finished," he corrected gently. "Just another piece of our story, ready for the next chapter." December arrived with bitter winds and deep snows that transformed the prairie into a vast white sea. Inside the McKinnon ranch house, Sarah discovered James's secret project one evening while building up the fire, a half-carved chess set hidden behind his ledgers, each piece revealing itself from raw wood with patient skill. "It was meant to be a Christmas surprise," James admitted, finding her with the night in her hands, something to pass the long winter evenings. Sarah traced the horse's graceful lines. "I didn't know you could carve like this. Mary's father taught me. Said every rancher needs something to do when the snow's too deep for regular work." He pulled out the other pieces. Pawns like little fence posts, a queen wearing a teacher's shawl, a king with a distinctly familiar broad-brimmed a hut. "They're us," Sarah realized, examining each figure. "All of us. Look, this bishop has Tommy's smile." The howling wind rattled the windows, but their kitchen was warm with lamplight and shared discovery. James brought out his carving tools, and Sarah watched as he worked on the final piece, a rook fashioned after the old school bell tower. "My father taught me chess," she offered. "Said it was important for a woman to think strategically. Mother was scandalized, of course." "Seems your father knew what he was about." James blew wood shavings from the tiny bell tower. "You've certainly managed this ranch's strategy well enough." Their comfortable moment was interrupted by urgent pounding at the door. Tommy burst in, snow coating his shoulders. "Wolf tracks by the south pasture. Fresh ones, and the cattle are restless." James was already reaching for his coat. Sarah rose too, but he shook his head. "Not this time. The storm's getting worse." "I'll keep the lamps burning," she promised, knowing he needed to focus on the wolves, not worry about her. "And heat. Bricks for your beds when you return." The door closed behind them with frightening finality. Sarah added wood to the fire, then gathered blankets and began heating bricks in the oven. The chess pieces watched from the table, their half-finished form somehow comforting in their imperfection. Hours crept by. Sarah kept herself busy, first preparing hot coffee and sandwiches for when the men returned, then grading her students' arithmetic papers by lamplight. The wind's voice grew fiercer, and she found herself picking up the carved queen, drawing strength from its solid presence. Finally, near midnight, boots stomped on the porch. James and Tommy stumbled in, snow-covered, but triumphant. "Drove them off," Tommy reported through chattering teeth. "Mr. McKinnon's shot scared them clear to the next county." Sarah had hot coffee in their hands before they could finish stamping the snow from their boots. As they warmed themselves, by the fire, she saw James eyeing the chess pieces still scattered across the table. "Not much of a Christmas surprise now," he said ruefully. "On the contrary." Sarah set the queen beside the king. "They're perfect, like us, still being shaped by time and circumstance, but stronger together." Tommy examined the piece carved in his likeness. "Don't suppose you'd teach me to play, Mrs. McKinnon? Winter evenings get mighty long in the cabin. We'll all learn together," she decided. "Make it part of the evening lessons, strategy and mathematics combined." Later, after Tommy had gone home with a warm brick and warmer thanks, Sarah and James sat before the fire with the chess set between them. Outside, the storm raged, but it couldn't touch the peace they'd built within these walls. "I've been thinking," James said, moving a pawn carefully, "about Christmas, about family." Sarah waited, sensing more to come. "Wrote to Mary's sister Caroline, asked if she and the boys might want to visit come spring. And I thought, if your sister Rebecca comes too," he paused, "might be nice to have a proper family gathering, show them all what we've built here." Sarah's heart swelled. This was what she'd come west hoping to find. Not just marriage, but belonging. A chance to build something larger than herself. "Check," she said softly, moving her bishop. Then, "Yes, let's gather them all here. Show them how love can carve beauty from the raw materials life gives us." James studied the board, then smiled. "Like this chess set. Not quite finished, but already telling our story." "And what story is that?" He captured her bishop with his knight. "That sometimes the best moves in life aren't the ones we planned. They're the ones we dare to make when the moment calls for courage." Sarah looked at their carved pieces, at the fire's warm light on her husband's face, at the snow swirling past windows that now felt like shields rather than barriers. "Checkmate," she said, moving her queen. "And yes, my love, yes to all of it." The new garden tools arrived with the first warm wind of March, a wedding gift months delayed by winter storms. Sarah unwrapped them reverently on the kitchen table, sharp spade, sturdy rake, gleaming trowel, each one bearing an engraving. "For Sarah McKinnon, from the ladies of Clearwater." "Seems they've finally decided you're staying," James said, watching her arrange the tools like precious jewels. As if there was ever any doubt. Sarah ran her fingers over the engraving. Not Mrs. James McKinnon or the new Mrs. McKinnon, but her own name, her own identity, recognized and celebrated. The morning glories she'd planted last fall were already pushing through the soil beside the porch, their tendrils reaching for the warming sun. Soon they would climb the same posts where Mary's vines had grown, adding their own story to the ranch's history. "Rebecca's letter came yesterday," Sarah mentioned, setting the tools in a neat row. "She'll be here next week, and Caroline writes that she and the boys will arrive the week after." James nodded, his face thoughtful. "Ranch is different from when Caroline last saw it. When Mary was—" He trailed off, but Sarah understood. "We've honored her memory," she said softly. "Made something new without erasing what came before." The proof was all around them. Mary's locket still held its place of honor, but now it sat beside Sarah's grandmother's daguerreotype, the cast iron. Skillet served up biscuits made from both Mary's recipe and Sarah's Boston variations. The quilt they'd made together draped across their bed, old memories and new dreams stitched into one warm whole. Their first anniversary was approaching, not the traditional paper milestone, but one marked by transformed spaces and healed hearts. The schoolroom now boasted 20 students, with Tommy apprenticing as an assistant teacher between ranch duties. The evening accounting classes had helped 3 neighboring ranches avoid foreclosure. "Got something to show you," James said suddenly. "Been waiting for the right moment." He led her to the barn, where the morning sun streamed through high windows. In the corner, beside Mary's old saddle, stood a new one, tooled leather, gleaming, with fresh oil. "Had it made in town," James explained. "Thought it was time you had your own, properly fitted. After that storm rescue last fall." Sarah touched the saddle reverently. Like the garden tools, it bore her name, but this time, in James's own careful hand, carved into the leather like a declaration of belonging. "The ranch is showing a profit," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "First time in 4 years, according to the ledgers. We could have used this money for what better purpose than this? James interrupted gently. You've put down roots here, Sarah, deep ones. This is just my way of saying I see that, honor that. Through the barn door, they could see the schoolroom windows gleaming in the morning light. The brass bell would soon ring, calling their growing family of students to lessons. The garden tools waited in the kitchen, ready to help plant new growth in soil that had lain fallow too long. I've been thinking, Sarah said slowly, about the nursery room, the one you and Mary planned before. James went very still beside her. Perhaps, she continued carefully, it's time to use it. Not as we originally thought, but I've had letters from 3 families asking if we might board their children next term. Youngsters too far out to make the daily ride. She felt James release a breath he'd probably hadn't known he was holding. A different kind of nursery, nurturing minds instead of infants. Life rarely gives us exactly what we plan, Sarah said, thinking of that long-ago train station. But sometimes it gives us exactly what we need. They walked back to the house together, passing the morning glory sprouts reaching for the sun. The garden tools caught the light as they entered the kitchen, their engraving a reminder of how far they'd come. Rebecca will want to help plant the garden, Sarah mused, and Caroline's boys can help clear the nursery room, make it a family project. Family, James repeated, the word rich with meaning. You know, when I saw you sitting at that station, I thought I was offering you shelter. Never dreamed you'd help me build all this. Sarah picked up the spade, testing its weight. Like their love, it was both sturdy and bright, practical and precious. Perhaps that's the secret, she said, not just building shelter, but growing something new together. 1 year to the day after their first meeting, James and Sarah McKinnon stood again at Clearwater Station. The August sun was just as fierce, the wooden bench still weathered, but everything else had changed. Hard to believe it's been a year, Sarah said, touching the new gold band in her apron pocket. They'd chosen the rings together last week, simple circles engraved with morning glories, to replace the borrowed ones that had seen them through their first year. The station clock that had witnessed their hasty decision still ticked steadily overhead, but now the platform was filled with familiar faces. Tommy and his mother, their students and their families, Caroline's boys running circles around Rebecca, who had extended her visit indefinitely after falling in love with both teaching and Tommy Wilson, all gathered to see us do properly what we did in such a rush, James mused, his own new ring warming in his pocket. Emma Thompson bustled forward with Sarah's original trunk, finally collected from storage. Found something you might want, she said, pulling out Sarah's never-worn wedding dress. Thought you might like to wear it today, since you never got the chance. Sarah touched the fabric thoughtfully, then shook her head. That dress belonged to another life, another dream. She smoothed her blue silk, a gift from James, chosen together in town. This is who I am now. The brass school bell had been carried to the station, and now Tommy rang it instead of the traditional wedding chimes. Students scattered flower petals, morning glories and prairie roses, as James and Sarah walked to where Reverend Thomas waited. Dearly beloved, he began, just as he had a year ago, we gather today not to join these two in marriage, for God and their own brave hearts did that last year. We gather instead to celebrate how love can bloom from the most unexpected moments, how joy can spring from sorrow, and how two hearts can find home in each other regardless of life's timing. Sarah's sister Rebecca dabbed at her eyes. Caroline's youngest boy proudly carried their new rings on a cushion made from a square of their storytelling quilt. Even Mrs. Crawford stood at the back of the crowd, her expression softened by time, and evidence of true love's victory. These rings, Reverend Thomas continued, holding them up, represent not the beginning of a journey, but its continuation. They are symbols of a love already proven through storms and wolves, through drought and plenty, through the joining of two lives into something greater than either could have been alone. James's hand was sure as he placed the new ring on Sarah's, finger sliding it on beside the borrowed one, that would be gratefully returned. With this ring, I continue my promise to love you, honor you, and thank God every day for bringing you to that station. Sarah's voice was steady as she did the same, the morning glory engravings catching the sunlight. With this ring, I continue my promise to love you, honor you, and bless always the courage that let us both begin again. The borrowed rings were ceremoniously returned to their owners, Mrs. Thompson and Station Master Peterson, both brushing away tears. The brass bell rang out again, its voice carrying across the prairie that had become Sarah's true home. "Look," James whispered, nodding toward the station's edge. Morning glories had sprouted there, their blue flowers reaching toward the sky. Whether from seeds carried by wind or dropped by Sarah during that first fateful meeting, they had taken root. In the most unlikely of places, just as love had. "Life's funny," Tommy observed at the celebration afterward. "How the worst day of your life can turn into the best, if you're brave enough to let it." Sarah looked around at their gathered family, blood relations and heart relations, students and neighbors, all bound together by one impulsive decision made in faith. "Not funny," she corrected gently. "Miraculous." The new rings caught the light as James took her hand, their engraved morning glories a permanent reminder that love, like flowers, could bloom in any season. The old station clock ticked above them, no longer marking time until an eastbound train, but measuring instead the moments of a life rich with purpose and joy. "Ready to go home?" James asked. Sarah smiled at the man who had seen not a stranded spinster, but a woman of worth and wisdom. "My love," she said, "I already am."